present a challenge right from the get-go, though, because there's been debate through the years what Champlain looks like. We've seen the drawings of him, but there's been, among the scholars and others, debate whether that's really Champlain, whether that's his portrait that we've seen. So starting this project, was that one of the first challenges? Do we really know what Champlain looks like, or do we try to create him from the latest research that we have?
Well, it's a good question, because it is a challenge, particularly when you're trying to visualize something. Mm-hmm. He wasn't someone who was of royalty, so he wasn't painted. He did do a little sketch of himself when he recreated the image of the battle that took place near Ticonderoga. But the actual drawing or art that represents him is actually, I think it was representative of Champlain in the 1800s in Canada. And it actually turns out to be a low-level bureaucrat, a financier, who was passed off as Champlain, who was a little bit later than Champlain, in the time of Louis XIII, I think. And for hundreds of years, that image of him with a little goatee and a mustache looking like Richelieu in a sense has been Champlain. So that's just one of the struggles, because Champlain wrote more than most explorers about his activities. He wrote 4 major books about the numerous times he explored from 1603 to 1618, say. And yet he revealed very little about himself, because these essentially began as reports to the king. King wasn't interested in his feelings, but wanted to know what he saw, what he heard, what was the chance of exploring, creating permanent settlements in the New World. So in a sense, Champlain hid his identity. So what we had to do was try to imagine who this man was from his actions, from his words, his character, and try to find a face that had the strength that we imagined him to be from what he did. And yet the sensitivity, because what was remarkable about him as an explorer of this period, you think of the stories from our history in this country, the English or the Spanish, and we have a very negative and very one-dimensional attitude about these people who were conquistadors, who saw the people who were here as either potential slaves or people to be removed from the land so they could farm. Well, Champlain came with a much more humanistic attitude. Coming from the years of war that he had experienced in France, I think he wanted to do something different. And so his treatment of the people that he encountered, that he depended on to survive, was very different. Much more full of respect. Actually, one of the things we draw on in the film, we articulate in the film, is his idea of coexistence between the French and the Amerindians, and in fact intermarriage as a way of creating a new society, but with a caveat that they still would be under the rule of the king and would have to be Catholic. But so we took that idea, and Marc can speak about this a little more, and tried to imagine what this man looked like.
And I know you're still developing the animation now, but you do have some images that you've created of what we believe Champlain looked like and what he'll look like in this film.
Yeah, actually, well, production-wise, we just started 3 weeks ago. There's been months and months of pre-production of Frank and I talking together. What do we want this film to be like and whatnot? But we just started 3 weeks ago production, and the first stage was to design these characters. Well, I won't say design, was to recreate them in some sense, if you will. Because most of the time when we do a 3D character, we'll either have a sketch of him, or we're going to have a picture of him if it's somebody that exists. Now in this case, there's no drawings, there's no authentic portrait of Champlain, and there's no pictures, of course, of that era. So we had to, like Frank was saying, read how Champlain would describe stuff, figure out his way of being. And then also use what we knew of the era, how the French are dressed, how they would wear their hair, how they would have their beard. And very early on when we started, we realized that the what I like to call the Spanish mustache wasn't of that era. So it's unreal to have Champlain wearing such a thing. So we decided, making him, we decided to go with a full beard and a mustache, which was at the time, more in vogue in France.
And certainly a different look than we've seen.
Yeah.
Frank, let's talk a little bit about the story itself.
Sure.
Will viewers be hearing the story of his exploration of Lake Champlain, or are they going to be hearing different parts of his travels both through Canada, New France, and the United States. I mean, many of us have only heard about that he came down and discovered Lake Champlain, but it's such a huge story. There are so many accomplishments that he has that is it tough to narrow the story down, and how are you going to do that?
Absolutely. When I was decided to work on this film as the producer and writer, it was a daunting task because Colin Powers, who was the exec producer, is the exec producer of this project, had written an excellent kind of a treatment of how to tell this story, or what the story was really, from birth to death. Well, that is a miniseries because the man lived a very full life in times that were extremely tumultuous and dramatic, including civil wars in France over religion, including spending 2 years in the Spanish colonies. And then if you look at the years from 1603 to 1616, full of exploration, full of warfare, full of attempts to create and then sustain the first permanent French settlement in Quebec. And then after that, 19 years of trying to, not only sustain Quebec, but expand it to other communities along the St. Lawrence until he died in 1635. So there's a lot of story there. And in addition to that, there's the complexity of the world in which he tried to navigate, being the world's here in this continent with the numbers of Amerindian nations that he had to negotiate with, that he had alliances with, that he had warfare with, that he had asked permission to travel, that he had to bargain to create a settlement, to bargain to explore different parts of the world. And in addition, and this is something as a filmmaker I can relate to, he needed support to do this. He needed to find financing. So he had to negotiate the complexities of the world of France, where you had basically a royalty, or the King of France and its court had been drained of any kind of funding because of the wars they just experienced. So they weren't about to spend money on something as risky as exploration and settlement in the New World. And so what they did was to offer enticements to merchants and royal individuals who would finance these voyages in exchange for a monopoly on the fur trade. And that, of course, created conflict with other merchants who had been coming to the New World to fish and to trade with the Amerindians for furs, who resented the monopoly. So it's a very, very complex story. So how do you tell that in an hour? And that was the struggle that I had for a number of months. And what I tried to find is I read very closely his books. And the first thing that struck me is how accessible they are, how clear he is in his writing and direct in his descriptions. So I can imagine this world. So that made me feel very comfortable as a filmmaker to think that, well, I can see what he's talking about, and he's very clear about what happened.
Marc Hall, Frank Christopher, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Dead Reckoning, Champlain in America will be premiering this coming fall here on Mountain Lake PBS.